Welcome back, everybody, to another week of Sunday School here at the Lighthouse Church of the Nazarene in Moravia, Iowa, where we're going through the book of John. This week, we're going to start John chapter 19. Now, what has been going on? Jesus has been arrested. He's appeared before Annas, Annas' son-in-law Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, and the Sanhedrin, and now he has been sent to Pilate. Now, Pilate is trying to release Jesus. He wants nothing to do with him, but the mob of Jews, they're not having anything to do with it. Pilate even gave him the choice. He said, hey, who do you want released to you? This Jesus who is called Christ or Barabbas, the known criminal? Surely you guys don't want Barabbas released. But what did the angry crowd say? They said, give us Barabbas and crucify Jesus. So we're going to start in John chapter 19. Let's get out our Bibles. Let's follow along. John chapter 19, verse 1. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. Now I'm reading New King James. It says scourged. Some translations will say flogged. The New Living Translation actually says whipped with a lead-tipped whip. So now, what was scourging? Scourging is when they would tie your hands to a pole, then they would expose your back, and they would whip you. And now this wasn't just any ordinary whip. The whip would have had a short handle with multiple whips coming out of it. And at the end of those whips, that they would have had metal or bone in them, so that when you whipped them, that they would actually grab chunks of flesh and tear it out of you. And the whip was actually called a cat o' nine tails whip. Now, flogging had three different purposes. One, just pure punishment. You're a criminal, we're going to punish you, and maybe this will deter other criminals from doing what you did. It was pure punishment. Another thing it was designed to do is designed to gain confession. But think about it. Jesus had nothing to confess, so it wasn't doing that for him. And the third purpose of flogging, scourging, it was to speed up the death of crucifixion. Crucifixion, if they were just set on a cross, could last for days. But if they were flogged first, that would speed up the process and they would die sooner. Now, sometimes people would die just from the flogging itself. It would be so bad that their internal organs would be exposed, and you could actually see their intestines and all their bone just from the flogging process. Now, we know this. If you turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, we know that the Apostle Paul actually went through this process 5 times from the Jews. I'm going to read in 2 Corinthians 11:24. And I'm in 1 Corinthians right there. 2 Corinthians 11:24. Let me read this to you. In 2 Corinthians 11:24, the Apostle Paul says, from the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've been in the deep. Paul goes through all these things that he went through just because he was trying to tell other people about Christ. So, isn't that interesting? The Apostle Paul says, hey, 5 times I received 40 minus 1, 39 lashings from the Jews. And Jesus actually warned his disciples. It's in the 10th chapter of Matthew. He says, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents, but harmless as doves. For they will deliver you up to men, and they will take you in the council and scourge you in the synagogues. So Jesus warned his followers, this stuff is going to happen to you. Now, let's go back to the Apostle Paul. Why did he say 5 times from the Jews I received 40 stripes minus 1? He says I received 39 lashings. Well, if you go back to the book of Deuteronomy, and it's Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 3, it says that a criminal shall not be beaten with more than 40 blows. It says 40 blows and no more. So the Jews would actually give 39 lashings just in case they miscounted and they didn't want to go over that extra 41. So let's ask this. How many floggings, whips did Jesus receive? Well, we don't know, because he was being whipped by the Romans. And I can tell you, the Romans probably didn't care what Deuteronomy 25:3 said. So we don't know how many times Jesus was whipped. We do know this about Jesus. If you go back to Isaiah chapter 52, verse 14, it talks about how his appearance, the Messiah, it was so disfigured that he didn't even look like a human being anymore. Jesus was flogged so bad that he didn't even look like a human. But we get that out of the Old Testament. We don't really get that description in the New Testament. So back to John here. Let's ask ourselves this. If Pilate thinks that Jesus is innocent and doesn't want anything to do with him, why is Pilate having him flogged at all? Why doesn't he just pronounce him innocent? Well, we find from the other Gospels, this is in Luke 23, Pilate is actually flogging Jesus just to try to get sympathy for him so that they'll want him released. This is Luke 23:16. Let me find it real quick right here. This is Pilate saying, he says, I will therefore chastise him and release him. So Pilate, why is he flogging Jesus? He's hoping that he'll gain the sympathy of the crowd. They'll say, you know what, this man's had enough. Let's not crucify him. Let's just release him. Now, I think this is interesting too. Isn't it interesting that the gospel writers, they don't go into great detail and give us like vivid description of what happened to Jesus during the crucifixion, during the flogging. I mean, we know he's going to get his side pierced with a spear and blood and water is going to pour out, but they really don't go into the vivid description of what happened. It's actually in the Old Testament, we get more description of it. If you go to Psalm 22, it talks about the crucifixion clear back in Psalm 22. It says, my bones are out of joint. I'm poured out like water. They pierce my hands and my feet. They can count all my bones. And then you go to Isaiah 52, and we get a lot of description from the Old Testament, even more than the New Testament. All right, so let's get back to John chapter 19 here. John 19, verse 1, Then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head. Now, we know from the writings of Tertullian that this crown of thorns stayed on his head until the very end. Verse 3, Then they said, Hail, King of the Jews, and they struck him with their hands. Now, we know from the book of Matthew that they also blindfolded Jesus during this process. So he was beaten, but he couldn't prepare for it. He had no idea where it was coming. And it also tells us in the book of Matthew that they were spitting on him, and they put a reed in his right hand as a scepter, just to mock Jesus a little more. Verse 4, Pilate then went out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him. And then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, Behold the man. I think when Pilate says, Behold the man, I think he's trying to appeal to their compassion right here. I think he's saying, guys, look at this. Does he look like a danger? I think we've done enough to him. Let's let him go. Verse 6, Therefore, when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify him. Crucify him. The crowd, they still have no pity on him. Right here, we can see what happens with a mob mentality. When a bunch of people get together and form a mob, it can be hard to stop. And we also see that separate from God, man is really nothing more than animals, are they not? So Pilate brings them out, says, Behold the man. They say, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. Pilate saying, you take him. Now, when we put all the Gospels together, we know that Pilate made at least 5 separate attempts to release Jesus. Pilate did not want to crucify Jesus. And we're going to find out in Matthew that even before he crucifies him, he takes water and washes his hands, say, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. And the Jews are going to say, his blood be on us and on our children. How scary is that to think about? So Pilate says to them, you take him. I want nothing to do with him. Verse 7, the Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Now the truth comes out. That he isn't there because of any made-up reason, trying to lead an insurrection, trying to mislead the people, trying to tell people they can't pay taxes to Caesars. Why do they want to kill him? Because he claimed to be God. Now, they're probably actually referring back to Leviticus 24:16 that says, whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall be put to death. And they're saying he's blasphemed God, he shall be put to death. So why is the real reason they want to execute Jesus? Because he claimed to be God. And you know what? He's guilty of that. Jesus did claim to be God over and over and over again. Do you remember when he was talking to the woman at the well? And the woman at the well, it's in John chapter 4. The woman at the well says, we know when the Messiah comes, he will tell us all things. You know what Jesus says to her? He says, hey, I who speak to you, I am he. In John chapter 8, Jesus says, and before Abraham was, I am. And in John chapter 14, and we could go through a bunch of these. In John chapter 14, Jesus says, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. So Jesus did claim to be God. He claimed to be the Messiah because he is, and that's why they're wanting to execute him. Verse 8, Therefore, when Pilate heard this saying, he was the more afraid, and went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. First of all, when Jesus gave him no answer, that's to fulfill Old Testament prophecy. That's Isaiah 53:7. I'm going to turn back there real quick. Isaiah 53:7. Isaiah 53:7 says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth." So why did he keep silent? It told us he was going to do it back in the book of Isaiah. It was to fulfill prophecy. But also, Jesus has already told Pilate where he's from. He says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight. But my kingdom is not of this world." He says, "I'm from another kingdom." And once God's told you something once, does he have to keep reiterating it over and over and over again? No, he doesn't. But I think Pilate saw something different in Jesus. Like even probably during the whole flogging process, I think Jesus took it different than any other man that Pilate had ever seen flogged before. And he says, there is something different about this man. Where is he from? Now, the apostle the apostle Peter, it's in 1 Peter 2:20. He actually uses this as an example for how we should act in our suffering. He says how it's commendable before you if when you suffer for doing good, if you just take it like a champ and stay silent. So let's see what happens here. Jesus gave him no answer, verse 9. Then let's go to verse 10. Then Pilate said to him, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you?" Remember who has all the power here? Jesus. Remember, Jesus was a volunteer, not a victim. This is the man who, at his breath could knock everybody down. Jesus, at a word, could have made Pilate stop breathing right there. Jesus has all the power. Everybody else is on trial. But look at what Pilate says. Imagine the pride here. "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you?" Talk about pride right here. Pilate is basically a guy in middle management. That's all he is. He has to report back to Rome. Pilate's a man in middle management lecturing the God of the world and saying, "Do you know who I am?" Let's keep going. In verse 11, Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." All right, a couple things here. First off, Jesus says to Pilate, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above." We need to realize God rules this world, and anything that is going on in this world is only because God allows it. Even the rulers and leaders who get put in power. This is Romans 13:1. I'm going to show this one to you. Romans 13:1. "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God." Well, isn't that interesting? The Bible says we're supposed to submit to the ruling authorities because they're there because they've been put there by God. Now, in the book of Acts, it says we need to obey God rather than man. So only when man's rules start to contradict God's rules supersede man's rules. We know that. But let's go to the book of Daniel. Daniel says this really, really good. Let's go Daniel 4:17. This is in reference to Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel 4:17 says, "Know this, that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will and sets it over the lowest of men." Daniel tells us the rulers, the kingdom of God, gives it to whomever he will. One more in the book of Daniel. This is Daniel 2:21. "Know this, that he, God, changes times and seasons. He removes kings and he raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise." So, and if you go to Isaiah chapter 3, it actually tells us that when God judges a nation, he takes away their godly leadership. Now, we'd have to say, well, why does God allow evil men to reign? If it's God who establishes it, why do we have evil men in leadership positions? Well, it's because that's who men want. He gives them over to their own devices. Remember in the book of Samuel, God was their leader. What do they say? "No, we want a king like all the other nations." So, back to John chapter 19 here. Jesus says, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Now, who is the one who delivered him to him? I always thought that this was referring to Judas right here, but it could also be referring to Caiaphas or maybe even Annas. After all, Caiaphas was the one that sent him before Pilate. So, who is Jesus referring to here when he says, the one who delivered me to you? Could be Judas, could be Caiaphas, or maybe even Annas. I don't know exactly who he's referring to. I always thought it was Judas until I started studying it this week. And then one last thing here, and we'll end here. Jesus said, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Greater. Now, that's an interesting thing that Jesus says, that somebody has the greater sin. I thought sin was sin. Are there actually degrees of sin? Well, sin is sin. Any sin can keep you out of the kingdom of heaven, but we also need to remember this. Any sin can be forgiven by God. Sin is sin, but the consequences of sin in this world will be different. After all, being angry at somebody and carrying bitterness towards somebody will be a lot different than if you kill them, or having lust in your heart versus committing adultery. The consequences of those will be different. So Jesus says, the one who delivered me to you, he had the worst sin. It's just an interesting thing to think about it. But one thing we always need to remember, that no matter how bad the sin or how little the sin, God is ready to forgive it. So we'll quit right there. We only got through 11 verses today, but we'll pick up right there next week. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I hope you learned something. And I'll see you the same time, same place next week. Bye.